Hello there, my sleepy fellows. Come, settle in, find a soft pillow, and let the weight of the day drift away like leaves upon a gentle stream. Tonight, we journey once more through Middle Earth, not along bustling roads or in the heat of battle, but through quieter paths where moonlight touches the earth and the air hums with forgotten stories. Beyond the safe borders of the Shire, past the misty mountains and silent plains, stand the Black Gates of Mordor, tall and forbidding under moonless skies. Once they were a symbol of dread, but tonight they are but a shadow in a tale long past. Tonight, we follow a quieter thread of that tale, the road that led through the Black Gates of Mordor. It was a path of shadows and silence, but also of quiet courage, where the bravest hearts moved not with pride, but with determination born of love and duty. Few dared to pass through them, and fewer still returned, but tonight we walk in peace, tracing the path not with fear, but with an understanding. What was it like to stand before those mighty gates, knowing the land beyond held nothing but shadow and ruin? What strength did it take to step forward, heart steady, when the world behind was safe and familiar? Our tale follows not just Frodo and Sam, though their courage shines brightest in memory, but the very land itself, the silent watchers upon the hills, the winds that carried whispered fears, and the faint hope that bloomed even in the darkest soil. And as we walk, you need not fear the shadows. They hold no power here, not in the quiet of this tale, where danger has long since passed, and only gentle memory remains. If you enjoy stories like this, feel free to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon. There will always be more paths to wander, more tales to tell, each one a gentle guide toward rest. But for now, there is nothing more to do, only to listen, to breathe deeply, and to follow the quiet road through shadow and light. In his cozy hobbit home, nestled beneath a grassy mound with a round green door marked by a polished brass knob, sat Frodo Baggins. He was quiet this evening, his book resting forgotten on his lap, while his gaze wandered through the open window. Outside, the first stars blinked awake, and the faint hum of night's gentle chorus rose from the hedgerows. Frodo was not restless, not exactly. The days had been peaceful, filled with the small pleasures hobbits hold dear, tea with friends, a stroll through the meadow, and the comforting warmth of the hearth. Yet, there lingered in his heart a quiet ache, a memory of roads walked long ago and questions left unanswered. For though the ring was gone and the shadow had passed, Middle-earth still held secrets, places untold in song, where the earth itself seemed to hum with forgotten stories. And among them was the path Frodo seldom spoke of, the road that led to the Black Gates of Mordor. Once he had stood before those gates, heart heavy and feet weary, knowing the road ahead held nothing but shadow. Yet, the gates themselves had been more than a barrier. They were the final threshold, the edge of all that was known and safe. Beyond them, the world fell silent, as though the land itself held its breath. Even now, Frodo wondered, not with fear, but with quiet curiosity. What remained beyond those gates now that the Dark Lord's hold was broken? Did the land, scarred and weary, find peace, Did green shoots rise from the ashes, and did the winds, once foul with smoke, now carry the scent of rain and earth? It was not adventure Frodo sought, nor danger. The days of such trials were long behind him, but understanding, that gentle yearning to know if even the darkest places could find healing, stirred quickly within him. And so, on this peaceful evening, as the last light faded and the moon rose silver and calm, Frodo stood, stretched, and smiled faintly to himself. Perhaps, he murmured, some roads, though once feared, deserve a second glance. Outside, the path curved gently down the hill, lit softly by moonlight. It called not with urgency, but with quiet promise. And though the black gates lay far beyond sight, their memory lingered, not as a threat, but as an invitation. For even the darkest roads once walked can lead not just to endings, but to peace. And tonight, in the comfort of quiet storytelling, we will walk that path once more, not in peril, but in gentle understanding. Frodo and Gandalf walked quietly eastward, the soft crunch of earth beneath their feet, the only sound between them. The air grew drier as they left the green lands behind, and the grass thinned, revealing patches of dark soil. It was not barren, but the earth here bore the memory of shadow, still healing, still cautious. For Frodo, the path felt strangely familiar, though the dread that had once weighed on him was absent. Now, there was only quiet determination, a gentle pull toward the unanswered question that lay beyond the black gates. Gandalf's pace was steady but unhurried, his staff tapping lightly against the ground. "You walk easier now, Frodo," the wizard observed, glancing down at his companion. "The road once burdened you. Now it seems to carry you forward." Frodo smiled faintly. "It's different without the ring. The weight was never just in the journey, was it? It was in what I carried, what I feared, but now it feels like I'm walking toward an understanding, not away from danger." The wizard nodded approvingly. "That is the way of true journeys. They lead not only across land, but within the heart." By the third day, the hills of the Amin Mul rose around them, jagged and weathered like the bones of the earth itself. Once, these lands had seemed lifeless and cruel, but now they stood quiet, their edges softened by time and the slow return of life. As they climbed a narrow path winding through sharp rocks, Frodo paused, resting a hand against the cool stone. Tiny green shoots sprouted from cracks in the rock face, delicate but stubborn. "Life finds a way," Frodo murmured, tracing a finger along one of the tender leaves. Gandalf, standing nearby, smiled. "Even in the most unlikely places, the darkness that once lingered here was powerful, but no shadow lasts forever. The earth remembers light, even when it seems forgotten." They pressed on, following the winding trail until it opened onto a ridge. From there, they could see the vast plain of Gorgoroth stretching eastward, still marked by scars, but no longer lifeless. Patches of grass, pale and thin, but growing, dotted the landscape. The rivers of ash had dried, their beds now holding pools of clear water that reflected the sky. In the far distance, barely visible against the horizon, stood the remnants of the Black Gates, silent, unmoving, and no longer guarded. Frodo drew a slow breath. "There they are," he whispered, more to himself than to Gandalf. The wizard's gaze followed Frodo's. "Yes, once they marked the edge of despair. Now they stand as little more than weathered stone. The power that held them closed is gone, and so they stand open, not as a threat, but as a question." As they descended from the hills, the path leveled into a winding trail that skirted the edge of the plains. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows that stretched across the ground like forgotten memories. It was there, in the quiet stretch of land between the hills and the plains, that they met an unexpected traveler. A lone figure, cloaked in soft gray, with a hood drawn up against the sun, stood beside a small spring that bubbled from the base of a rock. The figure turned as they approached, revealing an elf with hair like pale gold and eyes sharp as moonlight. "Travelers on the old road," the elf said, voice calm and clear. "Few walk this path without purpose. What brings you eastward, beyond the green lands?" Gandalf inclined his head in greeting. "Curiosity, Elenian. The lands beyond Mordor have stirred little talk in recent years, and my friend here," he gestured to Frodo, "wonders if peace has truly taken root where shadow once reigned." Elenian, tall, slender, and wrapped in the quiet grace of the Eldar, studied Frodo with thoughtful eyes. "Curiosity born of care, not conquest, rare indeed." The elf stepped aside, gesturing toward the spring. "The land does heal, though slowly. The roots are shallow, and the soil remembers the fire. But life is persistent, Master Baggins. Even the darkest earth cannot refuse the sun forever." Frodo knelt by the spring, dipping his fingers into the cool water. "I feared this place would remain lifeless," he murmured, "but it's as you say, life returns, quietly and without fanfare." Elenian smiled faintly. "The world does not sing of healing as it does of war, but healing, though silent, is the truer song." They parted ways with Elenian the next morning, the elf heading northward toward Ithilien, where the forests had begun to spread once more under the watchful care of the rangers. Frodo and Gandalf continued eastward, the Black Gates growing larger with each passing hour. The land, though no longer desolate, still bore the weight of its history. Broken weapons, rusted and half-buried, jutted from the earth like forgotten warnings. Stones blackened by ancient fires lay scattered along the path, their edges smoothed by wind and rain. Frodo paused beside one such stone, brushing away the dirt to reveal faint carvings beneath the soot. "Markings of old Mordor," Gandalf murmured, leaning over Frodo's shoulder. "Sauron's servants left their marks wherever they ruled, as if stone could hold dominion forever. But see how the runes fade. Time erases even the pride of tyrants." They pressed on, the air growing cooler as the sun dipped toward the west. When they crested the final rise, the Black Gates stood before them, tall and broken, their iron-bound doors hanging ajar. But the gates, once so foreboding, now seemed hollow. The darkness that had once poured from them like smoke was gone, leaving only weathered stone and rusted metal. Grass grew at their base, pale flowers blooming in the cracks between the stones. Frodo stepped forward, hand brushing the cold iron of the gate. "All that fear," he murmured, and now it stands empty. It's hard to believe this place once held the world in dread. Gandalf's expression was somber, but peaceful. Fear often outlasts its source, Frodo, but once faced, it fades, like shadow before dawn. You've stood here before, burdened by despair. Now you stand free, and the gate holds no power over you. They passed through the gates without ceremony, stepping onto ground that had once been forbidden. The plains beyond, once cracked and lifeless, now bore the faintest hint of green. Tiny shoots of grass pushed through the dark soil, and shallow pools reflected the pale sky. In the distance, the jagged remains of Barad-dûr rose like broken teeth against the horizon. The tower was no more, its foundations shattered, its stones scattered like sand. Frodo stood quietly, heart steady. "Even the mightiest fall," he said softly, "and the earth forgets their weight in time." Gandalf nodded. "The world moves on, Frodo. It does not dwell on sorrow, nor cling to triumph. It simply endures, as it always has." They wandered further into the plain, noting the slow return of life. Here, a cluster of wildflowers, their petals pale but vibrant. There, a small grove of saplings, their leaves trembling in the breeze. At the crest of a small rise, they found something unexpected, a cairn of smooth stones, carefully stacked and weathered by time. At its base, a single white flower bloomed, its petals bright against the dark earth. Frodo knelt beside the cairn, tracing the edge of one stone. "Someone came here after the war," he murmured. "Someone who believed even this place deserved remembrance." Gandalf smiled faintly. "Peace is not won solely by swords, Frodo. It is built stone by stone, choice by choice. Someone, perhaps a ranger from Ithilien, or an elf passing quietly through the world, chose to mark this place not with conquest, but with care." Frodo stood slowly, the flowers swaying gently in the breeze. "Then the Black Gates were never truly the end," he said quietly. "They were only a threshold, one we feared, yes, but also one we crossed, and beyond them, life continued." They camped that night within sight of the broken gates, the stars bright overhead and the land quiet around them. The air, once heavy with smoke and dread, was cool and clean. As Frodo lay beneath the sky, the grass soft beneath his head, he realized something profound. The quest had ended years ago, but the world had not stopped. It had gone on, quietly healing, quietly growing, and so had he. The next morning, they stood once more before the gates, looking westward now, toward home. "Do you feel you've found your answer, Frodo?" Gandalf asked gently. Frodo smiled, eyes calm. "Yes, the gates held no power of their own, only the fear we gave them. Now, they're just stone and rust, standing watch over land that forgets its pain and turns toward peace." They stepped through the gates once more, not as weary travelers fleeing shadow, but as quiet witnesses to the world's resilience. The path ahead stretched westward, winding gently toward Ithilien, and beyond it, the green hills of home. The Black Gates, once the edge of despair, now stood only as silent guardians of a land reclaiming its light, and the journey, far from ending, continued, step by peaceful step into a world quietly finding its way once more. This time, Frodo did not look back. The gates were behind him, the road ahead clear and welcoming, and in his heart there was no fear, no burden, only peace, as quiet and enduring as the grass growing softly beneath his feet. The Black Gates were no longer the end. They were simply another step on the road. Frodo stood at the threshold of the Black Gates, the massive iron doors hanging ajar, weathered by time and the slow decay of forgotten power. Once, they had loomed like the jaws of doom, sealing the path into the heart of shadow. Now, they stood silent and broken, guardians of nothing but empty plains and quiet winds. Gandalf, standing beside him, rested both hands on his staff, his sharp eyes softened by memory. "The gates were never the true barrier, Frodo," he murmured. "It was fear, the weight of what lay beyond, that held the world at bay." Frodo nodded, fingers brushing against the rusted iron. "And now that fear is gone, but what remains beyond them?" Gandalf smiled faintly. "That, my friend, is why we walk forward, not to conquer, but to understand." With a deep breath, Frodo stepped through the gates, leaving behind the edge of familiar lands. The earth beyond was dry and cracked in places, but no longer barren. Green shoots pushed through the soil, and here and there wildflowers bloomed, fragile yet determined. The plains of Gorgoroth stretched before them, once a lifeless expanse of volcanic rock and ash. But now, under an open sky, the land had begun to change. Grass, pale but persistent, crept across the ground in scattered patches. Pools of clear water glimmered where once only blackened craters had stood. Frodo knelt beside one such pool, dipping his fingers into the cool water. "It's hard to believe this was once a place of fire and ruin," he murmured. Gandalf nodded, gazing toward the distant horizon. "The earth heals, Frodo. Though it remembers its wounds, life does not return in defiance of darkness, but in quiet persistence like dawn after the longest night." They walked on, their path winding past jagged rocks and shallow ravines. In the distance, the remains of Barad-dûr stood like broken teeth against the sky, silent, crumbling, stripped of power. The great tower was no more, its foundations scattered like sand. Frodo paused, gazing at the ruins. "Even the mightiest fall," he said softly, "and the world forgets their weight in time." As they journeyed deeper into the plains, the signs of life grew more frequent. Small birds flitted among clusters of scrubby bushes, their songs soft and tentative. A hare, its fur mottled to match the earth, darted across their path and vanished into the tall grass. "It's strange," Frodo mused, "how quickly the land reclaims itself once the shadow is gone, as though it was only waiting for the chance to breathe again." Gandalf smiled. "Darkness stifles but does not destroy. The roots of life run deeper than any tyrant's reach. What Sauron sought to dominate, he only delayed. The moment his grip loosened, the world began to mend itself." They passed an ancient waystone, half buried in earth and moss. The carvings, once sharp and menacing in the black speech, were now worn smooth by rain and time. Frodo touched the stone lightly. "It's as though the land itself is forgetting his mark." "Not forgetting," Gandalf corrected gently. "Forgiving. Memory lingers, but it no longer holds power. Even the darkest scars, given time, become part of the landscape, no longer wounds, but stories of survival. Toward evening, they stumbled upon a curious sight, a small cairn, carefully stacked with smooth stones, standing alone in the middle of the plain. At its base, wildflowers bloomed, white, yellow, and pale blue, swaying gently in the breeze. Frodo knelt beside the cairn, tracing the edge of one stone. The arrangement was deliberate, not the work of wind or chance. Who would build this here, he wondered aloud. Gandalf's expression softened. Rangers, perhaps, or wandering elves. After the fall of Sauron, many passed through these lands, not as conquerors, but as caretakers. They did not seek to claim, but to remember. Among the flowers, Frodo spotted something glimmering faintly in the fading light. He reached down and carefully lifted a small pendant, silver, shaped like a star, its edges worn smooth by time. A star of the Dunedain, Gandalf murmured, a symbol not of war, but of vigilance and hope. Someone passed this way, Frodo, someone who believed even this place deserved remembrance. Frodo held the pendant for a moment, then gently returned it to the cairn. Hope, he said quietly, even here, where hope once seemed lost. As night fell, they made camp near a shallow hollow where water pooled after recent rains. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of earth and wild herbs. Stars sparkled overhead, bright and unchallenged by the shadow that once darkened this sky. Frodo sat beside the small fire, journal in hand, sketching the cairn and the wildflowers that surrounded it. "Do you think the land remembers?" he asked Gandalf softly. "The fear, the battles, the weight of the Dark Lord's will?" The wizard, seated on a mossy stone, gazed thoughtfully at the stars. "The land remembers, Frodo, but it does not dwell on sorrow. It turns its face to the sun, to the rain, to the quiet growth of roots beneath the soil. Memory shapes, but it does not bind, and neither should it bind us." Frodo nodded slowly, understanding dawning like the first light of day. He had carried the memory of Mordor for years, fearing that the darkness he had walked through would forever cloud his heart. But standing here, in the very land once held in shadow, he saw the truth. The earth had moved on, and so could he. The next morning, they continued eastward, drawing closer to the remnants of Barad-dûr. The air, once thick with sulfur and smoke, was clear and cool. As they crossed a narrow ridge, they came upon another relic of the past, the shattered statues of the Watchers, once grim sentinels that had guarded the inner reaches of Mordor. Now they lay toppled and broken, their stone faces worn by wind and rain. Frodo paused, studying the fallen forms. "They seemed so powerful once," he murmured, "unbreakable, but now they're nothing more than rubble." Gandalf nodded. "Power built on fear always crumbles, Frodo. It holds no true strength, only the illusion of it. When the source of fear is gone, the symbols that upheld it fall to ruin." Frodo bent down and picked up a small fragment of stone, smooth and cool in his palm. He turned it over thoughtfully before placing it back among the ruins. "Let them rest," he said quietly. "Their time is done." They reached the edge of the plateau where Barad-dûr had once stood by midday. The ground here was still scarred, blackened stones and deep fissures marked the landscape. But even among the ruins, life stirred. Tiny green shoots pushed through cracks in the rock, and butterflies, pale as moonlight, flitted among wildflowers. Frodo stood at the edge of a shallow crater, once the foundation of the Dark Tower. Now, it was filled with rainwater, clear and still, reflecting the sky above. Gandalf stepped beside him, gazing into the water. "Here stood the seat of Sauron's power," he said quietly. "Now it holds nothing but sky and water, light where once there was shadow." Frodo smiled faintly. Even the darkest heart can be made clean, given time. He knelt by the water's edge, touching the cool surface with his fingertips. Ripples spread outward, distorting the reflection of the sky for a moment before the surface stilled once more. "No shadow lasts forever," Frodo murmured as they turned back westward. The revelation settled quietly in Frodo's heart. The Black Gates, once the edge of despair, were no longer a threshold of fear. They were simply another passage, silent, weathered, and stripped of power. The land beyond, though scarred, had chosen life. The grass grew without fanfare. The flowers bloomed without songs of triumph. The earth did not dwell on the pain it had endured. It simply moved forward, embracing each moment of light. And so, Frodo realized, could he? For years, he had carried the memory of shadow, fearing it would forever cloud his heart. But now, standing in the very place where despair had once ruled, he saw the truth. Healing was not forgetting, it was remembering without pain, carrying the memory not as a burden, but as proof of resilience. Gandalf watched Frodo quietly, understanding clear in his wise gaze. "The gates were never truly the end," Frodo said softly, "only a turning point, and beyond them, life goes on." Gandalf nodded. "Yes, Frodo, and so do we." They turned westward, the sun warm on their backs, the path clear before them. Frodo walked easily, no longer weighed by fear or memory. The Black Gates had revealed their final truth, that no darkness, however deep, could hold dominion forever. The world moves on, and so do those who choose to walk in its light. And with each step, Frodo felt not the pull of the past, but the quiet promise of days yet to come, peaceful, unburdened, and free. The Black Gates were behind him now, and the road, ever winding, led forward, not into shadow, but into peace. Frodo glanced back toward the gates, now little more than dark silhouettes against the sky. "It feels strange," he murmured, "walking freely where once we dared not tread." Gandalf nodded, his staff tapping lightly against the earth. "Freedom often feels strange when one has long lived under shadow, but it is the natural state of things, Frodo. Darkness was always the intruder, never the master." They pressed on, following a faint path that wound eastward through the broken hills. In the distance, the jagged remains of Barad-dûr stood like crumbling teeth, stripped of menace and majesty. It was no longer a tower of power, but a ruin, forgotten by time and untouched by the world's quiet renewal. As they climbed a gentle rise, the land spread out before them, rolling plains dotted with wildflowers, the earth still dark but softened by the touch of new growth. It was here, amid the quiet hills, that they encountered the first true sign of life beyond mere plants and animals. A low, melodic hum drifted through the air like the echo of an ancient song. Frodo paused, brow furrowing as he turned toward the sound. "Do you hear that?" he asked quietly. Gandalf smiled faintly. "Yes, the land remembers its old music, though few now listen." They followed the sound down into a shallow valley where the ruins of an old watchtower stood, its stones covered in moss and lichen. Near its base, beneath the shade of a twisted but thriving tree, sat an elf, tall and slender, clad in a cloak the color of twilight. Her hair, pale as moonlight, shimmered softly as she turned toward them. "Travelers on the eastern road," the elf said, her voice calm and melodic. "Few to walk this way without purpose." Gandalf inclined his head. "Elenariel," he greeted, a warm smile touching his lips. "I had wondered if any of your kin still kept watch here." The elf rose gracefully, her keen eyes studying Frodo. "And I wondered if the ring-bearer would ever return to these lands, not as a burdened soul, but as one seeking peace." Frodo blinked in surprise. "You know who I am?" Elenariel nodded. "The earth remembers your footsteps, Frodo Baggins. The path you walked shaped not only the fate of the world, but the very land itself. And now you return, not to destroy, but to understand. That too leaves a mark." Elenariel gestured for them to sit beneath the tree, where the ground was soft with moss and wild thyme. As they rested, the elf spoke quietly of the land's deeper history, tales not often sung in the halls of men or even among the hobbits of the Shire. "Long before Mordor fell to shadow," she began, "these plains were known as Lithlad, the Ashen Lands. But in those days, Ashen did not mean barren. It referred to the pale grass that swayed like silver under moonlight, stretching from the mountains to the sea." Frodo listened intently, the soft cadence of her voice like a lullaby. It was strange to think of this place, once choked by smoke and fire, as a land of moonlit meadows and quiet beauty. "When Morgoth fell," Elenariel continued, "and the world was reshaped, this land lay forgotten, untouched by both light and shadow. It was Sauron, Morgoth's lieutenant, who claimed it, forging the plains into a stronghold of fear. But the earth does not truly belong to darkness. Even the mightiest tyrant cannot change the song of the soil." Gandalf nodded thoughtfully. "The power of the Dark Lord was always an intrusion, not a natural state. And now, without his will pressing down upon the land, the old melody returns." Frodo glanced around, noticing how the grass seemed greener near the roots of the ancient tree, how the flowers grew in soft clusters where the earth had once cracked and bled. Life had not been destroyed, only delayed. "But why does the land heal so slowly?" Frodo asked, voice gentle. "If the darkness was driven out, why doesn't everything bloom at once?" Elenariel smiled, the corners of her eyes crinkling with ancient wisdom. "Because true healing takes time. Scars do not vanish, they fade. The land, like the heart, must learn to trust the light again. Each blade of grass, each flower, is an act of quiet defiance against despair. And so, the world mends itself, not in triumph, but in patient resilience. As night fell, Elenariel led them along an old path, barely visible beneath the grass. It wound eastward, skirting the northern edge of what had once been the plateau of Gorgoroth. The land still holds secrets, she explained, paths that existed long before Mordor's shadow fell. They were forgotten, swallowed by darkness, but now they stir again. The path led them to a shallow dell where the ruins of an ancient way station stood, weathered stone arches covered in moss and ivy. In the center of the dell, a small spring bubbled up, its water clear and cold, reflecting the stars above. Elenariel knelt beside the spring, brushing her fingers lightly across its surface. This was once a resting place for travelers moving between the lands of Nirn and the northern plains. The spring was said to hold the memory of clear skies, even when the world above was clouded. Frodo cupped his hands and took a sip of the cool water. It tasted of fresh rain and something older, like the scent of earth after a long drought, when the soil first remembers moisture. It's hard to believe this place existed under Sauron's rule, Frodo murmured, that such peace could lie hidden beneath so much fear. Gandalf chuckled quietly. Even the darkest rain cannot smother every ember of peace, Frodo. Some places, like some hearts, hold fast, waiting for the shadow to pass. That night, they camped near the way station, the fire crackling softly as Elenariel shared more of the land's forgotten lore. After the fall of Sauron, she said, many believed this land would remain barren forever. The scars of war are slow to fade, but the earth is older than any tyrant, and it remembers its true shape. Life returns, not in grand triumph, but in quiet persistence. Frodo listened, heart quiet and calm. The fear that had once gripped him when thinking of Mordor was gone, replaced by gentle wonder. The land was not a graveyard, but a garden slowly reawakening. Do others know of this? He asked. Do the people of Gondor or Rohan come here, now that the shadow is gone? Elenariel nodded. The rangers of Ithilien watch the borders, not as wardens, but as caretakers. They do not seek to conquer this land, only to understand it. King Elisar himself decreed that Mordor, though once an enemy, should not be left to waste. The fields of Nirn to the south are already green with crops tended by those freed from bondage. Frodo smiled faintly. So even the darkest places can find new purpose. Yes, Elenariel agreed softly, but not by forgetting. The land remembers, Frodo, as do those who walk it. Healing is not erasure, it is acceptance. The shadow was real, but it no longer defines this place, and it no longer defines you. Frodo looked down at his hand, where faint scars still marked the place where the ring had once rested. For years, he had viewed those scars as reminders of suffering, but now, sitting beneath the stars in a land once ruled by darkness, he saw them differently, not as wounds, but as proof of endurance. The next morning, they parted from Elenariel with quiet farewells. She turned northward, toward Ithilien, while Frodo and Gandalf continued east, their path winding toward the Eithel Duath, the Mountains of Shadow. Once those jagged peaks had marked the edge of despair, their slopes barren and lifeless. Now, as they drew closer, Frodo saw something unexpected. Green moss clung to the rocks, and small trees, no taller than a hobbit, had taken root in the crevices. The mountains themselves soften, Gandalf observed, his voice thoughtful. Even stone, given time, can embrace life once more. They climbed a narrow trail that led to a high ridge overlooking the plains. From there, they could see the full sweep of the land, once gray and lifeless, now dappled with green and gold under the morning sun. Frodo stood quietly, the breeze cool against his face. This was never the end of the world, he murmured, only the edge of a story, and beyond it, life continues. Gandalf smiled, eyes twinkling. Yes, Frodo, life always continues, if we let it. They descended into a sheltered valley where the remnants of an old orchard stood, gnarled trees, their branches heavy with pale blossoms. The trees, long dormant under shadow, had begun to bloom once more, their roots finding nourishment in soil cleansed by rain and time. Frodo touched one of the blossoms, its petals soft and cool. Even here, he whispered, beauty returns. Gandalf laid a hand on Frodo's shoulder. The heart of Middle-earth beats on, Frodo, not in the halls of kings or the towers of wizards, but in quiet places like this, where life, though tested, endures. They made camp beneath the blossoming trees, the scent of flowers mingling with the cool night air. Frodo fell asleep easily, his heart light and unburdened. As dawn touched the valley with gold, they rose and turned westward, the Black Gates now far behind them. The path ahead was clear, winding gently toward Ithilien, and beyond it, the familiar green hills of home. But Frodo did not rush. For the first time in years, he walked not to escape shadow or seek answers, but simply to experience the world as it was, scarred, yes, but beautiful in its quiet resilience. The Black Gates, once the edge of despair, had become merely another marker along the road, not an end, but a beginning. And as they walked, Frodo smiled, the weight of the past finally falling away like leaves before the wind. The road continued, peaceful and unbroken, stretching onward beneath an open sky. The fields of Nirn stretched quietly beyond the plateau, the dark soil now rich with new growth. Barley and rye swayed gently in the breeze, their golden tips catching the soft light of morning. Frodo stood at the edge of a narrow path, gazing across the fields where farmers moved between the rows, tending the land with quiet diligence. It's hard to believe, Frodo murmured, his voice thoughtful, that this land, once filled with the sounds of marching feet and the smoke of industry, now hums with life. Gandalf, standing beside him, nodded slowly. The land was never the enemy, Frodo. It was merely bent to a dark will. Freed from that burden, it reclaims its purpose, not as a place of fear, but of renewal. Frodo's gaze lingered on a small child, no older than 5, chasing a butterfly along the edge of a barley field. Her laughter rose like birdsong, clear and bright in the morning air. The people here, Frodo continued quietly, they were once slaves, weren't they? Forced to work these fields for Sauron's armies. Yes, Gandalf replied, his expression somber, but they are slaves no longer. King Elisar granted them stewardship of these lands, not as conquered territory, but as a gift, freedom, not dominion. They now tend the earth for their own sustenance, not for war. Frodo watched as a woman knelt by a row of young plants, her hands careful as she pulled away weeds. Nearby, a man lifted a bucket from a shallow well, the water clear and cool under the rising sun. Life finds a way, Frodo murmured, echoing Gandalf's words from days before. The wizard smiled, eyes crinkling at the corners. Indeed it does. Even here, in the heart of what was once darkest, light takes root. They continued southward, skirting the fields and following an ancient road that led toward the distant hills. The path was uneven, stones cracked and worn by time, but it was no longer treacherous. Grass grew between the stones, and wildflowers lined the edges, their petals pale blue and golden yellow. By midday, they reached a small rise overlooking the remnants of an old outpost. Once a watchtower for Sauron's forces, it now stood half collapsed, its stones weathered and softened by moss. But it was not the ruins that caught Frodo's eye. In the center of the clearing, where once a fire pit had burned to signal the movement of armies, stood a slender tree, young but strong, its branches reaching skyward. Tiny white blossoms clustered along its boughs, swaying gently in the breeze. Frodo paused, heart catching in his chest. A tree, he whispered, here of all places. Gandalf stepped forward, studying the sapling with quiet reverence. Not just any tree, Frodo. This is a seedling of the white tree of Gondor, planted, I suspect, by one of King Elisar's rangers, a symbol of hope, rooted in the very soil that once bore the weight of tyranny. Frodo knelt beside the tree, his fingers brushing the rough bark. Hope, he murmured, even here. Gandalf smiled, especially here. The greatest strength lies not in lands untouched by shadow, but in those that rise from ruin and bloom once more. As they rested beneath the young tree's shade, Frodo found his thoughts drifting, not to the past, but to the path they had walked. The Black Gates, once an impenetrable barrier of dread, now stood silent and forgotten. The plains of Gorgoroth, once lifeless and cracked, now blossomed with quiet determination. It wasn't the gates themselves that held power, Frodo said quietly, more to himself than to Gandalf. It was the fear they represented. Without that fear, they're just stone and iron. Gandalf nodded. Yes, Frodo, fear binds more tightly than chains, and it lingers long after the cause is gone. But you've seen the truth now. The gates were never truly the end. They were merely a threshold, one that you crossed long ago, though you did not know it then. Frodo looked down at his hand, where the faint scar from the ring still marked his skin. Once, he had hated that scar, seeing it as proof of weakness and loss. Now, it seemed less like a wound and more like a reminder of endurance, of survival, of quiet victory. The real power, Frodo murmured, was never in the gates or the land beyond them. It was in choosing to walk forward, despite the fear. Gandalf's gaze softened. Yes, Frodo, that is the heart of all true quests, not to conquer, but to understand, and you have understood at last. They lingered beneath the tree until the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the clearing. When they rose to continue their journey, Frodo found his steps lighter, his heart unburdened. The road led them toward the southern edge of the plateau, where the land sloped gently downward into a wide valley. Here, the last remnants of Mordor gave way to the green fields of Nirn, no longer fields of forced labor, but lands tended by free hands, their harvests rich and plentiful. Frodo paused at the crest of the hill, looking back toward the north. In the distance, the jagged remains of Barad-dûr stood like broken teeth against the sky, stripped of menace, nothing more than crumbling stone. He smiled faintly. "Even the mightiest fall," he said softly, "and the earth forgets their weight in time." Gandalf laid a hand on Frodo's shoulder. "Not forgets, Frodo, forgives. The land does not hold grudges, nor does it dwell on sorrow. It simply grows, inch by inch, until life outnumbers ruin." Frodo nodded, understanding at last. The power of the Black Gates had never been in their strength, but in the fear they inspired, and now, without that fear, they were nothing more than weathered stone, silent, powerless, and forgotten. Their path curved westward, looping back toward the gates themselves. As they approached, Frodo saw them in a new light, not as barriers, but as relics of a world that no longer held sway. The iron doors, once sealed against all hope, hung ajar, rusted hinges creaking softly in the breeze. Grass grew at their base, and tiny white flowers sprouted from cracks in the stone. Frodo stepped forward, hand brushing the cool iron. He felt no fear, no burden, only quiet acceptance. "The gates were never truly closed," he murmured. "Only in our hearts." Gandalf smiled. "And now your heart is free, Frodo. The journey is done, not because the road ends, but because you no longer walk in shadow." Frodo nodded, taking one last look beyond the gates. The plains stretched eastward, dotted with green and gold, the land no longer barren, but quietly alive. "Let them stand," Frodo said softly, turning away. Not as a warning, but as a reminder that even the darkest thresholds can be crossed, and beyond them, life goes on. They passed through the gates without ceremony, their feet falling quietly on the worn path. The land behind them, once feared, now familiar, faded into the distance as they walked westward toward Ithilien and the green hills beyond. Frodo's heart, once heavy with memory and doubt, now felt light and unburdened. The shadow that had haunted him, not of the ring itself, but of what it represented, had finally lifted. As they crested a final hill, the Black Gates fell from view, hidden by the gentle curve of the land. Frodo paused, looking back one last time. "No longer an ending," he whispered, "but a passage, and beyond it, peace." Gandalf rested a hand on Frodo's shoulder, his expression warm. "Yes, Frodo, the gates were never truly closed, and neither are you." With a deep breath, Frodo turned his face westward, toward home. The road stretched before them, clear and welcoming, beneath a sky soft with the promise of evening, and as they walked, Frodo realized that he no longer feared the path behind him, nor the unknown ahead. For the true journey, he understood now, was not in reaching a destination, but in finding peace along the way. And with each step, the weight of the past fell further behind, until only the lightness of the present remained. The gates stood silent in the distance, forgotten by the world, their power broken not by force, but by understanding. And the road, ever winding, led not to shadow, but to peace. Frodo and Gandalf walked westward, the black gates fading into the horizon behind them. The land, once scarred and lifeless, now stretched quietly under the soft light of evening. The sky, pale gold near the horizon and deepening to twilight blue overhead, seemed to embrace the earth in gentle peace. Neither spoke for some time. The silence between them was not heavy, but companionable, like the hush that falls after a long-awaited understanding. Frodo glanced over his shoulder one last time. The gates, once towering symbols of fear, now stood like forgotten sentinels, half covered by creeping vines and grass. What once had been an ending was now merely another part of the landscape, weathered, silent, and powerless. Turning back to the road ahead, Frodo sighed softly, a breath that felt like the final exhale of an old burden. "They don't frighten me anymore," he murmured. Gandalf, walking steadily beside him, smiled. "No, Frodo, they never truly did. It was not the gates themselves, but what they represented, the unknown, the weight of what lay beyond. But you've crossed that threshold, and the fear no longer holds you." Frodo nodded, understanding at last. "The gates were only ever a door. It was my own heart that held the lock, and now—" He spread his arms, gesturing to the open plains before them, golden in the fading light. "Now, the world feels open, free." They camped that night beneath a low hill where a cluster of wildflowers, pale blue and white, had taken root among the rocks. Frodo sat quietly by the fire, the warmth casting soft shadows across his face. His hand drifted unconsciously to the place where the ring had once hung around his neck. The scar was faint now, more memory than mark. He had once feared it would forever remind him of loss and struggle, but now it seemed more like a testament to resilience, a quiet proof that wounds, though real, did not define the heart that bore them. "I used to think I'd never escape its shadow," Frodo murmured, watching the flames dance. "That no matter how far I walked, I'd always feel the weight of it, the memory, the fear." Gandalf's eyes, wise and gentle, met his across the firelight. "Memory remains, Frodo, but memory is not burden. It is the soil from which wisdom grows. The fear you carried was real, but it no longer shapes your path. You've walked through shadow and come out the other side, not unscarred, but unbound." Frodo smiled faintly, the fire's glow reflecting in his eyes. "Unbound, yes, that's how it feels." They rose with the dawn, the sky streaked with soft pink and gold as the first light touched the hills. The path westward was clear, winding gently toward Ithilien, and beyond it, the green heart of Middle-earth. Frodo's steps were light, no longer weighed by uncertainty. He walked not as one fleeing danger or seeking answers, but simply as a traveler at peace with the road itself. As they passed through a shallow valley, they came upon another cairn, like the one they had seen days before. This one was smaller, but at its base bloomed a single white flower, its petals pure and bright against the dark soil. Frodo knelt beside the cairn, fingers tracing the smooth stones. "Another marker," he murmured, "a reminder of what was and what now is." Gandalf stood quietly, his staff resting lightly against his shoulder. "Not all victories are sung in halls or carved into stone, Frodo. Some are marked only by the life that returns, quietly, persistently, where once only shadow lay." Frodo placed a small pebble atop the cairn, a final gesture, not of mourning, but of acknowledgement. "The Black Gates were never truly the end," he said softly, "only a passage, and beyond them, life continues." As the sun climbed higher, they reached the edge of Ithilien, where the land grew greener and the air sweeter with the scent of wild herbs. The dark soil of Mordor faded beneath their feet, giving way to soft grass and scattered groves of young trees. Frodo paused, turning once more to gaze eastward. From here, the gates were no longer visible, hidden by the gentle rise and fall of the land. "It's strange," he said quietly. "I thought I needed to see the land healed, to know for certain that the darkness was gone, but now, it doesn't matter if I see it or not. I know. The healing isn't just in the earth, it's in the heart that chooses to walk forward without fear." Gandalf smiled, eyes twinkling. "And so, the final lesson is learned, not in finding answers, but in embracing peace. The gates closed long ago, Frodo, not by force, but by understanding, and now they hold no power over you." Frodo nodded, the breeze stirring his hair as he turned westward once more. "Home," he murmured, "not as an escape, but as a choice, a place not to hide from the past, but to live in peace with it." They walked quietly as the day stretched toward afternoon, the road winding gently through meadows and glades. Birds sang in the branches overhead, and the earth, soft beneath their feet, held the warmth of the sun. Frodo's heart was light, unburdened by the weight he had once carried. The Black Gates, once the symbol of all he feared, had become nothing more than a distant memory, stone and rust, powerless and forgotten. He glanced at Gandalf, who walked with the easy grace of one who had seen ages pass and knew the worth of quiet moments. "The road goes ever on," Frodo said softly, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Gandalf chuckled. "Indeed it does, Frodo, but now you walk it not as one fleeing shadow, but as one embracing light." They crested a final hill, and there, far in the distance, the faint outlines of the green hills of the Shire rose against the horizon. Home, familiar, welcoming, unchanged. Yet Frodo knew that though the land was the same, he was not. He returned not as one haunted by the past, but as one who had made peace with it, scars and all. As they descended toward the familiar lands of Ithilien, the path soft beneath their feet, Frodo felt a quiet certainty settle within him. The gates, the fear, the weight of the journey, they had all been part of the road, but none had defined its end. Peace, he realized, was not found in reaching a destination, but in the choice to walk forward, heart unburdened and eyes open to the quiet beauty that surrounded him. And so, step by step, the shadow fell further behind, until only light remained. Sleep well, Sleepy fellows, the gates are past, the journey is done, and peace, ever patient, ever gentle, has found its way home. May your dreams be light, your rest be deep, and your heart be untroubled, now and always. The road goes ever on, but for now, it leads only to peace.